We have our speaker, and I'm going to ask Ron to introduce our speaker for tonight.
All right, thank you, Madam President. I have the distinct honor to introduce Kimberly Strassel, who most recently was here to talk to us 3 years ago. Since that time, she's added another child to the brood home. And there's a bio that we found in your bulletin so that you can read about her accomplishments. As a Princeton graduate, Wall Street Journal editorial board, and also a television commentator on the Paul Gigot Journal Edition report, or Journal editorial report that's on weekly. We enjoyed her comments last time, and so without further ado, I'll give you Kimberly.
I think if this works, I might use this microphone, and if you'll all forgive me, I'm going to remain seated only because I have discovered, you want me to stand up. I don't actually do very well walking and talking at the same time. It's a bit beyond me, but it is so incredibly nice to be here. I want to say what an honor it is to be asked. It was actually so inspiring to just get to see an induction too, which I've never seen. Prior to moving down to this area, I have only ever lived in very large cities in my adult working life. I'd been in Brussels and then London and New York City. So this is the first time I have actually lived in a smaller community, and I absolutely am amazed by it. And Rotary is so important. You guys, the amount of work you do in the community and with the community and for community has just been something that's inspired me since I've lived here. So I am very honored to get and come to talk to you tonight. As Ron noted, it's been about 3 years since I was here. We've had 2 elections since then, and I have indeed had another child. It is an open question which of those events was a more painful experience. I would say that at least at a childbirth you get something lasting and joyful, which is not something you can normally say about anything that comes out of the political system. Speaking of elections, often when I'm asked to come speak to groups, it is to talk about an election. There always seems to be one that was just passed or one that is coming up. I'm thrilled to say to you tonight that I'm not going to be talking about an election here. We are at that very, very short and rare moment in the American political calendar where we're about a year on from the presidential. We are almost a year out from the midterms, and so I am going to revel in this moment and not talk about polls or voter sentiment or who's running the Senate and what's likely to happen. I thought instead I would rather, instead of giving a big themed speech about the state of the nation and upcoming elections, I just instead offer a few remarks about what has happened in Washington over the past few months and what is likely to be happening this fall. We are now about halfway through the first year of the second term of the Obama presidency. And normally at this point, you would probably already have the opportunity to talk about what the theme of that presidency is. And that's because most two-term presidencies, at least in modern history, have tended to follow a pattern. Presidents who win second terms have traditionally, and with very good reason, viewed the opening of that second round as this very brief and important moment to get something of great substance done. You know, they've just been through a grueling re-election that occupied a lot of their time, and yet now they can say a majority of voters did indeed support them again. Their bucket of political capital has been refilled. They often bring with them in their victory greater majorities in their party in the Congress, so they have more support for their initiatives. Sometimes there's a renewed sense of bipartisanship right after election. And most importantly, there's this urgency in the first year of the second term to get something done before everyone does indeed start to think about the next election. If you look over the last 30 years of two-term presidencies, they pretty much all follow this model. Ronald Reagan, after his landslide election, his administration put everything it had into getting what ended up being the 1986 tax reform. Bill Clinton, He started a little bit early with welfare reform, but when he won re-election, he went on to get the balanced budget agreement that he did, also to get Republicans to get behind him on his S-CHIP program, which still exists today. It's a federal children's health care program. Even George W. Bush, he ran on, campaigned on, and tried to push through both Social Security reform and immigration reform. He didn't get those things done for a variety of reasons, but it wasn't for a lack of trying. The Obama presidency has been decidedly different than any of this. If you think about it, he didn't really run on a big idea that he wanted to get through last year. While he has talked about immigration as a top priority for the administration, I can tell you as somebody who's in Washington, it is notable that his White House does not seem to have the kind of energy and driving force toward getting that done that you might see in other presidencies, the way that the attention that prior presidencies have put on their second-term agendas. What you've seen instead has been a bit more of a hodgepodge of legislative ideas, some of which have come up simply because they've come up. For instance, the gun control debate that happened earlier this year. But beyond that, a lot of smaller things like requests for more stimulus or suggestions for more funding for universal preschool, things like this. What is most fascinating for someone who watched politics is that this is, amazingly, deliberate. The White House has actually let it be known that they are doing this on purpose, that what they are trying to do is flip the usual paradigm of two-term presidencies. And the best way I saw that described was in a Washington Post story that appeared in early March, and I'm going to quote from it. The goal is to flip the Republican-held House back to Democratic control in 2014, allowing Obama to push forward with a progressive agenda on gun control, immigration, climate change, and the economy during his final 2 years in office. So the goal here, again, is not to actually push anything big these first 2 years, but rather to try to win back the House next year, grow his numbers in the Senate, and then as a result have more support for doing the agenda the way he wants to do it. This is incredibly fascinating, not only because it's very bold and it hasn't been tried before, because it's also very risky. If he does not win back the House next year, and history is usually not kind to presidents in midterm elections, he is looking at a continued Republican opposition to his agenda out of the House and potentially an entire second term that has no big wins. But I think on a more immediate level, which is what is most interesting to me, and a lot of journalists and a lot of observers are beginning to see this, is that the more immediate impact of not having an overriding agenda in the first or second year of your second term has been that this White House has ended up being far more at the mercy of events that have happened and is likely to remain far more at the mercy of events as we go forward. I can tell you as a member of the press corps for 20 years, if there is a vacuum of news, if the White House is not putting out a story every day and driving it, we will come up with something else to fill the news hole. So this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to go through some of those events, what defined the spring and what is likely to dominate the fall. I think in terms of the first part of the year, as I said, we did have a gun control debate back in February. We also had the Senate pass an immigration bill, which was a very notable moment for the country. But the story, the overwhelming story that has dominated Washington throughout the spring was this confluence of these scandals, controversies, political haymaking, and I'm going to leave it to each of you and your own political inclinations to decide how you want to term them, that happened back in April and May. I want to talk about them briefly, in part because they're going to continue to matter, but also because while these controversies tend to get lumped together frequently in the press, it's all one big scandal, the reality is that the big ones, and by which I mean the IRS and then this NSA data mining story, are in fact very different in the ways that they are going to matter in Washington in the coming months. Now, the biggest of these arguably was in fact the news from the IRS Inspector General that the agency had inappropriately singled out and targeted conservative groups that had applied for tax-exempt status. When that story first broke, pretty much every elected official in Washington came out to condemn the IRS and seemed to recognize the gravity of this. In recent weeks, and it's probably to be expected, we have seen this story become far more political You know how Democrats claiming Republicans are hyping this. You have Republicans claiming Democrats are obstructing the investigation. The White House itself made some news recently by suggesting this was a bit of a phony scandal. Two things I want to say about the IRS. The first is that I personally think it is really a terrible shame that this has descended so quickly into politics. Because the reality is, and if you work in Washington, you come to see this very quickly, that aside from the military, aside from the Department of Justice, which has the ability to prosecute you and jail you, there really is no federal authority that has a more awesome and destructive power than the IRS. They can ruin your business, they can take your home, they can put you in jail, they can shut you up in an election, they can pretty much destroy everything that the Founding Fathers said was important to the country. So in my mind, regardless of whether this was done by some rogue agents in Cincinnati acting of their own accord, whether this was a result of some enormous bureaucratic ineptitude, whether this was done on a political order, either way, it's one of the more disturbing cases of government abuse to come out of Washington in decades. And when you add in the fact that this particular abuse centered on the issue of political speech, which is a real basis of democracy in this country, I think it becomes even more grave. And that gets to the second point, which is that no matter what you have heard, and no matter what you might hear, this story is not ending. And in fact, it is only just beginning. And part of that is because it's so disturbing. But the other problem, and I think this is a problem for the IRS, and I think it's a problem for the Obama administration, and I say that only in the regard that it happens to be in the unfortunate situation of being in power at the time that this is happening, is that this could not have happened to a nicer agency, okay? The problem they are finding is that everybody hates the IRS, all right? You can go out there, most Americans, they don't have any interaction with most agencies in Washington. The NLRB, the SEC, no one has dealings with the Ag Department other than farmers. Most Americans just don't interact for the most part with most agencies. But everybody knows the IRS, and everybody hates the IRS. Republicans hate the IRS, Democrats hate the IRS. I mean, there might be some tax attorneys who like the IRS, who work for the IRS, but other than that, nobody likes the IRS. And so what you have to imagine is it's almost a sort of big dam with the water threatening to flow over. And once there's the tiniest crack, the entire thing implodes. It's that whole trust thing, which most of us have dealt with in some regard in terms of our employees who work for us, or our family members. When you have trust, everything sort of trundles along as usual. The minute you lack trust, then you have a reason to go back and re-examine everything. And that is what is now happening here. The minute the news, the IRS, this broke, that the IRS had done this, every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the entire United States came to congressional investigators to start to tell their own experiences with the IRS, okay? And whether or not those experiences were legitimate, and many of them probably were, it doesn't really matter. It's all open for discussion now. And so what we're seeing in Washington, and you aren't hearing so much about it yet, but it's coming, is an exponential widening of this IRS probe, okay? Put aside the question that actually kicked all this off about whether or not some groups were singled out for extra scrutiny. You now have investigators looking at whether groups that already had tax-exempt status were singled out for retroactive investigations and audits. You're looking at whether there are groups, aside for those that call themselves Tea Party organizations, were selected for scrutiny because of their policy positions. You have investigators looking at whether individual donors were audited because of their contributions to particular political candidates. You have old stories being dragged up. There's one group that came out and has now talked about what happened to them in the 1990s by the Federal Election Commission, back when Lois Lerner, and you may know her, she's a woman that took the fifth. She was working for the IRS. She didn't want to testify. She used to work for the FEC. You have the groups talking about the treatment that they received when she was working at the FEC. Happened to them. And speaking of the FEC, just this last week, we had that body come out that the House Ways and Means Committee is looking at whether that organization was doing its own targeting of groups, because they've now discovered that there were emails between FEC investigators and Mrs. Lerner while she was at the IRS. And the problem here, the biggest problem here for the IRS, and even I feel the slightest twinge of sympathy for this agency, is that if you have an organization that is that big and sprawling, there are mistakes that are just waiting. to be discovered, okay? Even if those mistakes were honest ones, they're all going to come out, because at the moment, this organization is getting what you might call the political equivalent of a colonoscopy. I mean, it is just really, really brutal. And as I said, you're not going to hear much about it over the next month. Congress is in recess. There's not going to be any big profile hearings. But even as we speak, there are people pouring through thousands of emails, investigating and having interviews with employees. And you can bet that this is going to prove, I think, one of the more enduring political controversies that has come out in a number of decades. That being said, it's worth noting that this IRS case is largely a question of revelation. This is going to be about a story about what happened in the past, of piecing it together, of informing the public. It isn't necessarily going to be the sort of story that affects future legislation or changes political alignments in Washington. And in that regard, it is in fact very different from the other big controversy of the spring, which was the debate over the NSA database of telephone numbers and other associated spy questions. I have to tell you, when I first heard the story about the NSA, the most secret spy agency in the country, and the fact that it was, spying, it took me about an hour to get my head around what exactly was the news story here. And even today, I still find it all slightly a bit weird. But as we all know, the effect of this has been to bring into the public arena a lot of details about the NSA's program that were not known before. And the bigger effect of this has been to set up a delayed debate 12 years